our presentation. If the chat window is bothering your experience, you can pull that to the side or minimize the window. But what we do like to hear is from where everyone's from. I saw there's someone calling in from Riverside, and I do think we're going to chat about Mission Inn for a minute. And we do have people from 18 states are participating today. I'd like to welcome our speaker for today. His name is Craig Owens, and I have recently bought his book, Haunted by History. I know he's in here somewhere. Craig, yeah, there he is. Go ahead and start your audio and your video. Welcome. How are you today?
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me. Yeah, the whole concept of the book actually came from taking vintage style photo shoots in what were historic hotels. And what I ended up finding was that in some instances there would be strange things that would happen, strange disruptions, doors opening, slamming on their own. I didn't even believe in shadow people at the time. And then at the Mission Inn, I saw one. And, you know, I went home and slept for 10 days with the lights on afterwards. But I got real curious about, you know, what was really haunting there. Was it, you know, what was it? So what were these spaces? What were these rooms? What were they used for? And so I started what I thought would be a real thin book, ended up becoming a tome, because what I ended up finding out is that not only were the paranormal claims sometimes doctored up, but sometimes the history was wrong too. So I ended up fact-checking everything. I mean, everything. I went to oftentimes original sources, and I found forgotten stories that had been overlooked by historians in past books or marketing, you know, hotel marketing departments. And it opened a whole new world. I just fell down one rabbit hole after another rabbit hole after another rabbit hole. But after having something strange happen at the Mission Inn and then at the Pierpont Inn in Ventura, friends and family were basically saying, you know, you should try this at other places. So that's what I did. Is I would go to these historic, they had to be historic, haunted hotels, bring an entourage of people. We'd stay about 4 or 5 days, rent all the supposedly haunted places, and we would conduct these kind of period inspired old Hollywood photo shoots there. And then we would monitor. So we would do all of this first, and I would create a theme or some kind of thing that I thought might evoke or trigger paranormal activity. And if nothing got triggered, at least I walked away with nice photos, right? So
yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to John to screen share, yeah. And then after you are done, we will get in on the chat. So I'm gonna close off my video. Take it away.
Okay. So anyway, that's how the whole genesis started. And so I'd run these tests, and then I would go in and do the heavy research, because I was trying to figure out whether or not that these paranormal claims or these ghosts, or for what lack of a better word, were they somehow connected to the history of a place. And in some cases, it seems to be exactly that. However, what I was noticing a lot were that people were actually twisting history to fit the ghost story rather than using history as a litmus test to see whether or not the paranormal claims are even legitimate to begin with. So it became like a 7-year ordeal. And in the process, I ended up becoming, you know, a historian at several places. And so I have a lot to say about a lot of hotels. My book, just real quickly, it covers 8: the Hotel del Coronado, the Julian Gold Rush Hotel, the Mission Inn, the Alexandria Hotel in downtown LA. It's not really a functioning hotel anymore, but it certainly was in its heyday. The Pierpont Inn, the Banning House Lodge on Catalina Island, probably forgetting one, but it ends with the Glen Tavern Inn in Santa Paula, California. And so I ended up finding myself, and this is an example of the kind of the shoots that we would do. This was actually taken in the Valentino Suite of the Alexandria Hotel. And it was part of a 1911 addition to the hotel. One of the funny things about this, we can actually forward a little bit. We'll save the Cecil for last, I guess. But let's start with the Alexandria Hotel. This turned out to be my favorite hotel in all of Los Angeles. And the history just absolutely blew me away. And I was really taken back by how little of that information was actually made public, or it seems like all the historians in LA, which there are a lot of them, just kind of ignored this one. And it really was the heartbeat and social center of Los Angeles. It opened in 1906. It was Los Angeles's first 5-star hotel. It also served as the Plymouth Rock, one of the Plymouth Rocks for the film industry that was coming west from New Jersey and New York. Hollywood wasn't really established yet. So this became like the place where the movie directors, the movie stars showed up. And it also attracted just the rich and famous. And it sold out. It was an immediate hit from the moment it opened in 1906. They expanded it in 1911. We started construction in 1910, finished in 1911. That's what you see, that building in the back that says Alexandria. That was the addition. It also had what was a ghost wing, which is still around today on 5th Street. That was actually part of the original building. But it now has separate ownership over a dispute over the property in 1937, which led to it being walled up. Now, one of the great myths and the ghost myths that popped up in the 1990s was that Rudolph Valentino haunted the Alexandria and haunted the Alexandria Suite. And doing the research, Rudolph Valentino was definitely there. He was there in 1917, and he actually lived with another actor in one of the rooms for about 2-3 weeks, but no one knows what room it was in that he stayed in, and all those records have since long been destroyed. Now, the myth of the Valentino Suite, if you can forward the advance it, this is what the Valentino Suite looks like today. It looks funky and whatever, but what ended up happening and how this room got its name was it went through several periods, ownership changes, and of course downtown declined rapidly. And in 1970, the owner was a guy named John Creedman at the time. The city had passed some exemptions and tax breaks for people that owned older buildings. So he was actually, when he originally bought the building, he was going to tear it down. But enough people told him that, no, this place is historic. You really should look into it. So he did. And he hired a couple of women that did the research, and they found out that all these people lived here. So what he did is he actually paid for a kind of a Victorian revival restoration, and they named certain suites in honor of some of the famous people that were at the hotel. So they picked a suite on the top floor of this annex, this 1911 annex, and they dubbed it the Rudolph Valentino Suite. And so they wallpapered it. This is all 1970, what you're seeing, wallpaper. And the headboard is 1970. And that carpet used to be a lot darker. It's now like Pepto-Bismol pink. But here's the thing, is they actually picked a suite that actually was haunted. And when weird things started happening, people just naturally assumed or jumped to the conclusion that it was the ghost of Rudolph Valentino haunting that place. And we can go to the next slide. That's during my photo shoot there. I tested the claims, and I brought a lot of the furnishings in myself, and I tried to drape it up to look like something from the 1910s and 1920s. And sure enough, I will say that the story about that space being haunted is true. We had a door slam on us once it got dark, And it was not in a wind tunnel. It was a door that had actually been wedged open. And we tried to close it earlier in the day and it wouldn't budge. And keep in mind, there was no air conditioning and this room hadn't been really redone since 1970. So the tiles in the bathroom where this door was wedged open, the flooring was warped. So I didn't want to damage the door. I didn't want to break anything. So I left it open. Sure enough, after dark, you know, the leasing agent that gave us this place, he came up after work and he wanted to help. So I gave him a spotlight and I sent him in one of the other rooms and had him flash the spotlight on this model that you see. And I'm trying to get this particular shot. And suddenly the leasing agent said, "Can you mind hurrying? It's getting cold back here and I'm getting scared." And about 5 minutes later, that door slammed about 10 feet away from him. He screamed and the light that he was holding was shaking. That look on the woman's face is actually a look of real fear because this was taken, you know, moments after the door slam, and she's dressed in boots and a cape. And I know what was going through her mind. If anything else happens, she's a goner because it's almost impossible to move or run out of the room wearing a cape and that kind of regalia. But very interesting, but I see a lot of misinformation on the website, even to, and on the internet to this day, saying that Rudolph Valentino lived in this room. Other rumors that I heard or stories that I heard was that one of his wives or girlfriends committed suicide in the room. Not true. There were a lot of strange deaths at the Alexandria. Absolutely, just as strange as the Cecil. In fact, there may be more deaths at the Alexandria than the Cecil altogether. But I also find it interesting that, you know, when the filmmakers for American Horror Story, when they decided to do a season based on hotels, Cecil got all the attention as being the main inspiration, but actually the Alexandria was almost 50% of the inspiration behind it too. It just didn't get any attention for it. But the whole Valentino vampire, if you've seen the season, that part, and the sealed off wing, which I had mentioned earlier, that was also part of it. Now, as far as one last bit on the Alexandria, is that they're okay with you know, talking about the hauntings. They don't necessarily promote it that strongly, but they do allow me to do tours there, or at least I did pre-pandemic, and I'm not able to take people up to the Valentino Suite, but I showed them the ballrooms, and the ballrooms are very active. People see shadows all the time. In fact, the last time I held a tour there, which was last November, just 4 hours before we arrived, a security guard radioed in that he had seen a shadow in the lobby that walked right through a wall. There's also a great space down below in the parking garage where some of the original 19 teens tile that had been covered in like a tarp where cars could drive over. It's beginning to peel off, and you're beginning to see sections of what was once the 19 teens tile. It's really cool. If you ever go on a tour, I'll show you. So let's move on to the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary, I'm sure many of you have followed what's going on. It's in bankruptcy right now. The Queen Mary was always a troubled ship, and now a building. And yeah, ever since it arrived in Long Beach in 1967, and what most people don't realize is it's been sitting dormant in Long Beach longer than it was an active ship in the ocean. A lot of misconceptions about this ship, and it became kind of a place where paranormal people just went all the time, and they made up a lot of stuff over the years. Jackie the ghost child, there's no record of a child drowning in the swimming pool named Jackie. You know, but let's get back to when the ghost stories first originated. The ghost stories, as far back as I can tell through research, actually originated in the 50s, believe it or not. And it was crew members, and there were children ghosts that were seen on the ship, but they were usually on the upper levels of the decks. And one of the common claims was that they would hear them playing in cabins, a steward or whatever passing by, and they thought, oh, no one's supposed to be in the cabin. So they'd go and get the keys, open it up, nobody in the room. Sometimes it'd be a crying baby. That was a common story. Believe it or not, go to the next slide. The first, oh yeah, that's one of the pictures that I took there, trying to capture the beauty of the old Queen Mary with the modern Long Beach skyline. If you go to the next one, this is the first class swimming pool. This is actually off limits today because it's fallen into deterioration. But this has always been like the hot spot, the most talked about haunted space on the Queen Mary. And I do find that it is active. We did pick up some stuff when I did a photo shoot there. Interestingly enough, the ghost stories about this place being haunted also started in the 50s, but it wasn't children ghosts like it is talked about today. What was then were people were picking up male voices, screaming for help or something like this. Now, I think a lot of the paranormal activity seems to stem from the Queen Mary's years as a transit ship, taking troops back and forth, mostly American troops back to over to Scotland. And this area, this pool was not active during this time. In fact, it was walled, almost floor to ceiling barracks, and it was seriously overcrowded. So that would make sense as to why there would be male voices crying out in anguish or something, because that's what it was used for during the war service. As far as drownings are concerned, this story started surfacing in the 80s, and the drownings, and there's just no evidence that anyone drowned. The truth of the matter is, with the Queen Mary, is that anytime the ship had encountered any kind of turbulence, they immediately shut down the pools. So they were very mindful to avoid drownings at all costs. So this swimming pool wasn't open and operational all the time. The next slide is, the changing rooms. This is where there seems to be a lot of paranormal activity. In the 1950s, this is where the stewards that would go in and clean before shutting down the pool for the day or night. This is the area actually where they were encountering paranormal activity too in the 1950s. Interestingly enough, I gotta tell you how the ghost story started in Long Beach, is that, and this is something that not too many people know about, is that from the moment that it pulled into port, there were a few caretakers that were staying on there, and there were some people trespassing even back then, sneaking on board. But there were some interesting sounds that were being heard by crew and workers that when they were trying to convert it into a tourist attraction. And one of the early ghost stories had to do with people hearing a bellhop calling out like Mr. Warrington or something, and there'd be nothing around. Word started spreading in around 1969, 1970 that there was paranormal activity on the ship while it was in Long Beach. And even some of the city council members at the time had heard weird things like music coming out of some of the ballrooms, like, it'd be like some kind of band. It was all vintage music when there were no speakers and no music supposed to be playing. And word got back to a paranormal writer named Hans Holzer, who actually contacted the city of Long Beach around 1970, and he wanted to bring on psychics and do an investigation. That angered the city council. They turned him down, and then they went into this no ghost policy, where no one was allowed to talk about it at all. And this lasted roughly almost a decade. They did try to experiment with a ghosty kind of tour in the mid 70s, but it didn't do very well. And then in 1983, they started to open it up and started dropping the hints to the newspapers, letting newspapers start to cover the paranormal activity. And then by 1987, 88, it was full on marketing for the paranormal. So why did they do that? It's actually one of those stories where they had screwed up in turning the former ship into a tourist attraction once they were forced to open it up in 1971, ahead of what they had wanted to do. They were just kind of forced to because they had spent so much money, and people were getting real impatient. They opened it up and they realized that people were coming on board the ship only once, and then they would leave and they wouldn't come back. And it was the paranormal that actually brought people back more than one time. So that's why they went gung-ho with it. And, you know, at least as of 5 years ago or so, you know, they had like 3 or 4 different ghost tours. You take each one and you get a complete different set of facts and figures and tales, tall tales. A lot of them weren't accurate. A lot of them were just made up. My understanding is that they're trying to, the paranormal will probably resume if the Queen Mary is saved and it was, you know, and it opens back up again. But the last leaseholders were looking to finally get rid of some of the stories that were not true. No murders, you know, documented murders on board the ship, none of this stuff. And just kind of get back to basics again, which I think is very smart. So that's the Queen Mary in a nutshell. The Aztec Hotel in Monrovia is actually one of those places where almost all the information that you find online is going to be marginally correct, if not completely incorrect. This has always been a mystery place, and the ghost stories are mysterious too. I first stumbled onto this place in 2009. Believe it or not, I fell in love with it. It's kitschy. It's, you know, a real strange building. The architect was Robert Stacy Judd, who was part con man, part P.T. Barnum, and part architect, you know, and he came over from Britain. And this was his first gig, his first paying gig in the United States. He had his offices on Hollywood Boulevard. And the genesis of it, it's a long story about how this strange building came about. But originally, the people of Monrovia, the Chamber of Commerce, wanted to build something like the Mission Inn. And so they were thinking indigenous all the way. But they had planned to build it on a hillside close to Myrtle. And they were contemplating having little ladders where people could climb up to access the hotel. Well, and they even got Benton, who was one of the architects of the Mission Inn, to draft plans for this huge mission-style hotel. It was completely impractical. It was going to cost $500,000. So the Chamber of Commerce dismissed that idea, but they liked the indigenous one. So they found a company that promised them the moon if they would, and help them get financing to build a tourist hotel. And this company that they contracted with introduced them to Robert Stacy Judd. The original drawings were supposed to be Hopi, but Robert Stacy Judd came across some old Mayan textbooks, and he decided that he would create something that was Aztec or Mayan. It was actually Mayan, but he sold them on the idea that it would be Aztec because Americans would be more willing to, they know more about Aztec, it resonates. So they agreed. The city agreed to finance this. They got a loan. It went way over budget, took a year to build. It was built before Route 66, by the way. And it opened, it started in August 1924, and it opened on September 1st, 1925. And it was an immediate dud. Despite, you know, getting a few good reviews, it got lots of bad reviews. That's the lobby. It's still surprisingly intact. Barker Brothers did the furniture. Stacy Judd commissioned and hired some like old Hollywood silent film professionals to do some of the work, and everything was done very unique. And he wanted to make it look like the interior of an excavation into an Aztec pyramid, a tomb. So even though it wasn't recessed, he gave the illusion that it was recessed or a sunken lobby, and it was dimly lit. Fabulous. Unfortunately, all the Barker brothers stuff is long gone, but you see those chandeliers, they're still there, believe it or not. It was done by a woman in the San Fernando Valley that her husband worked for a studio. Well, it went through some really horrible times. All the people that invested in it lost their money. It went into bankruptcy in 1927. It was sold at auction, and it changed hands many times. And then it even shut down in 1932 and wasn't reopened until 1937. And then once it reopened in 1937, it did amazingly well, but that had to do with its close proximity to Santa Anita Park, the racehorse track, which had opened in 1934. So it did really well in the 40s. During World War II, Santa Anita Park was shut down and the Aztec business suffered. That's when prostitutes supposedly moved in to the hotel. And at one point late in the war, the local military forbid all servicemen from even coming to the Aztec Hotel because of the vice that was going on. Fast forward, when I came in to check into this place, room 120 was supposed to be the haunted room. And as the story goes, there was a speakeasy that was in the basement, supposedly. And around 1928, 1929, supposedly there was a murder or manslaughter that took place in 120, and it involved a prostitute that was in the speakeasy, picked up a John took her up to room 120, and they got into a fight, argument, and he slammed her into that heating unit that you see and just left her to die. That's the story. And that story originated around 1990 when a psychic did a walkthrough with a reporter for the LA Times. And the psychic lady came up with the name Razzle Dazzle. So this took fire, it went viral. And by the time I was there in 2009, Razzle Dazzle was the ghost of the Aztec Hotel in room 120. Now, I used to stay in room 120 all the time. This is me restaging the story. And then when I went through all of the archives, there was absolutely no death in this room that was documented. Certainly, I think that there is probably some merit between this a speakeasy there. That story goes way back. It wasn't just made up for marketing purposes. But what I did find interesting is that in doing the research of the place, just a block away was an old Elks Lodge. And that while the Elks Lodge was under construction, the Elks used to meet at the Aztec Hotel. And they used to throw card parties once a month on like a Thursday night. And the name of the card parties were Razzle Dazzles. And so I thought that was really interesting that a psychic in 1990 would pick up on the name Razzle Dazzle in connection with a haunting in room 120, because there is a historical connection, at least with the name. So maybe the haunting has something to do with something that happened around that time. I don't know, but it did have a dark history. There's a picture of the basement. The basement actually is virtually untouched from the time it opened. It hadn't been modified or space rearranged. It's still pretty much the same layout that was in Robert Stacy's original architectural renderings. That is a creepy place at night. And I've caught some really weird things there. And I think one of the weirdest voices is I was there one night and I picked up a deep male voice saying one set of deuces. And once I heard it, I was like, well, what does that mean? What is that? So I looked it up and it was a poker hand. And so I thought, well, maybe there was a speakeasy because, there definitely seems to be a place where gambling took place. And gambling was a major part of the Aztec Hotel's history as well. A lot of card games going on and bookies and, bets being placed after a day at Santa Anita Park. So the owners right now, the Aztec has been closed for a long time. It went into receivership during the Great Recession, and it was eventually sold to a Chinese family. And they've been working with the Historical Society there, and they've actually made some improvements. Some things didn't get improved so well. And they are allowing me to do tours every now and then. I mostly focus on the history tours. The family, they're kind of in between on what to do with the paranormal there. They did confide that, that they have had some experiences there. This is one of the model rooms that they were working on. Now they claim that they're going to reopen the hotel as soon as the pandemic dies down a little bit more. But this was taken around, I want to say 2016, 2017. This was an example of what, some of the rooms were. And this actually keeps in the spirit of the original hotel, because the original hotel, believe it or not, every single room had a different color scheme, and it was like the Mayan color scheme. So you would get like a red walled room, you would get a blue or teal walled room, and you'd get a yellow walled room. And so they were trying to keep with this. I don't know whether they're going to continue with this or not, but I did have a weird experience while shooting this photo at the Aztec. I had set up the room to shoot. No one was supposed to be in the hotel, just the general manager and 3 workers. And so we left the room to go have lunch. And when I came back from lunch, one of the chests, prop chests that I brought from home was actually sitting on a crossbar on that vanity table that you see on the right. Underneath, it's this real narrow, just little balancing bar. And it was the strangest thing, because I had this big chest that was set aside, and I was going to pack it and take it out of the room later, but it was sitting right on that little balance bar. And then the books that you see on the table, they were all rearranged and put in a weird place. No tampering with my camera, no tampering with the lights, no tampering with anything, just those real weird little things about the room. And so the general manager asked the workers, when they came back, did you guys do anything? And they all said no. And in fact, they got kind of spooked once we told them why we were asking. And we took the pictures, but that's a common thing there. I mean, I've had weird things happen to me where I'd go out or things would be misplaced. My last night in room 120, the room key disappeared off the dresser, and that turned out to be the only key to the room. And I went and, when it came time to check out, I was very apologetic. And they said, well, don't worry about it, we'll find it. They ransacked that room, they moved everything out, couldn't find the key. So they didn't replace the key or replace the lock. They were just renting it to people, just saying, just keep in mind, you can't lock it. Well, 6 months later, a couple that was staying there checked out, and they just found the key that would have been in the room, and they just turned it in when they checked out. And I thought, how weird is that a key would go missing for 6 months and then suddenly reappear in the room that it had disappeared from. So the Aztec is definitely haunted. It'll be interesting to see what happens once it opens. Hollywood Roosevelt, that's actually a project I'm working on right now. And just real quickly, there are so many things wrong with the ghost stories in this place. It's like, I don't even know almost where to begin. But the ghost stories started percolating around 1989. And it was shortly after a major renovation of the hotel. They seem to have left out a lot of the history of this, the real history of this building. They got the first site of the first Academy Awards is correct. They got the year that it was open correct, but they don't talk about the in-between years. And one of the most glaring absences is this long-term owner named Thomas E. Hull, who bought the hotel in 1934, and he held on to it until his death in 1965. And what's interesting is that he is the one that built the Cinegrill, which opened in 1935. He was the one that built the cabanas, which were completed in 1950, the swimming pool, which was opened in 1950, and yet nobody mentions him. He also was one of the main people, the pioneers of the Vegas Strip, and also one of the very first people to build motels in California. So I think when I'm ready to really introduce this, I'm going to make a big effort to try to boost Tommy Hull's presence. But the Marilyn Monroe story, you know, just long story short, she hardly had any connection with the hotel whatsoever. She might have been there 2-3 times. It wasn't really a place that she would be seen because it was mostly a tourist hotel, and it was overrun by publicists and agents and whatnot. And she was actually already suffering from the pains of fame and was trying to retreat and trying to find these other little places that gave her a little bit of a break from the fame. There's no way she could have lived there in the late 40s in the cabanas because they weren't built yet. And as far as the famous story about the Marilyn Monroe mirror, that someone had claimed to have seen a blonde apparition in the mirror reflection in the mid 80s. I've read stories where that mirror was gifted to the hotel from Marilyn Monroe. That was her favorite mirror. There's the story about Fox Studios giving the mirror to the hotel, and in both cases that was supposed to be Marilyn's favorite mirror. Well, in doing the research, I found out that that's just one of the original mirrors, full-length mirrors that was in the cabana when it opened in 1950. So it wasn't special to Marilyn Monroe at all. It's just one of the last surviving ones. I think there were like 61 of them. And so now we just have one. So I'm not saying that someone didn't see a ghost. It's just that the mischaracterization that it was Marilyn is something else. And the whole reason why the whole Marilyn thing surfaced in the first place had to do with the 100-year anniversary of Hollywood, the big celebration. The hotel had just reopened after a major renovation. They had placed a star honoring Natalie Wood right in front. And later that year, they had the first major Marilyn Monroe exhibit ever, marking the 25th anniversary of her death. So they brought in a bunch of merchandise, and it turned out to be the biggest hit of the year for the hotel. Far more people showed up than what was anticipated, far more than the 100-year anniversary celebration. So the hotel got the idea, let's just keep going forward. So I tell you what, I think we're getting close to the end of the 30 minutes. So let's go back to the Cecil. And we'll talk about the Cecil's history. The Cecil, of course, has had a very troubled history, and it's still troubled. One of the problems is the current sensationalizing of the place. I've had to correct things. I finally decided to go to Wikipedia to correct it because I just kept seeing misinformation over and over and over again. And basically, a lot of the claims and a lot of the posts say that the hotel was opened in 1927. That's absolutely not true. It opened on, I believe, December 20th, 1924. And it wasn't a luxury hotel ever. There were no like movie stars, galas. It did have a party when it opened, but it was always a middle-class hotel. And there was nothing terribly you know, there was nothing terribly outstanding about the hotel other than it was close to, you know, a train station, and so people arriving to town or subway, or whatever traffic hub, they could just walk to the Cecil and check in. One of the fun stories that I did like about it is that circus performers did stay there, and that's one of the things that got overlooked. Now, one of the things that have come up over the years is the Black Dahlia connection, and actually that's how Christine found me, was that it was like, no, 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 the Black Dahlia had nothing whatsoever to do with the Cecil Hotel. And she's showing you some things that she found.
Yeah, Craig, do you want to just give a quick 2-sentence story about the Black Dahlia?
Yeah, well, the Black Dahlia is one of those unsolved murders where everyone's got a conspiracy as to how she died. She was a, you know, an attractive woman that was found brutally murdered in 1947 in a vacant lot. She had been sliced up. She was not wearing any clothes, and the police, you know, had a number of suspects, but then the press got involved, and the press kind of helped steer the whole investigation way off course. The newspapers were the one that actually gave her the name Black Dahlia, but it was Elizabeth Short. Her friends called her Betty. There's some contention as to whether or not she was an actor or not, but she was definitely a girl that was just trying to make it in LA. And she was extremely beautiful, and I think that's what caught everyone's attention, and they went for it. Now, there
Seems like
was,
everyone's trying to retrace her last steps. So I think that's where the hotel Cecil comes in, right? So where was she last seen?
she
You
was
know,
last,
was it?
right.
Go.
Well, how the Black Dahlia urban legend started is simple enough. There was an erroneous report in 47 where a police officer swore that they saw her running out of the hotel, saying that she was being stalked by two guys or whatnot. That was dismissed as not factual. The police did investigate that story, and they went to a nearby bar where a bartender said, well, I think I might have seen her, but I wasn't sure. That turned out to not pan out at all. So the story quickly went away. She was last seen at the Millennial Biltmore, and that was it. And she was dropped off on January 9th, and then on January 15th, her body was found in a parking lot. Now, in 1995, in the LA Times, in a column, a columnist quoted a book author who had a popular book in the 90s called This Is Hollywood. And he said that on January 11th, 1947, mind you, that's 2 days after she was last seen at the Biltmore, that she had been seen drinking in a bar at the Cecil Hotel with a lady friend and two sailors. And he also went on to say that in the week before her death, she was hanging out in all the downtown bars right next to the Cecil. And this falsehood just quickly came and went. No one paid any attention to it. But then there was an author who does some historical writing, and she wrote a piece for KCET, and she found this one little blurb, and she puts it into her article and kind of embellished it. And then suddenly, and then it got published in 2015. And so then it started picking up traction. Then 2 years later, in 2017, there was a documentary trying to sensationalize the Cecil and Eliza Lamb's death and all the suicides there. And so they got this writer who had written this piece in 2015 to be the historian for this curse of the, I think it's called Curse of the Cecil Hotel or something like that. And so they got her to be the historian, and she just hit that same falsehood again. And by that time, because it had reached a national audience with the documentary, it became viral, and then suddenly everyone was saying that it was the Black Dahlia, was last seen at the Cecil Hotel. And obviously, from a psychological viewpoint, there are some loose similarities between Eliza Lamb and Black Dahlia, Liz Short, in that they were, young, attractive women that died under mysterious circumstances, or at the time, mysterious circumstances. I think Eliza Lamb's death has finally fully been explained, and wasn't murder.
Right. Like this is so just for everybody in the audience, I saw a lot of discussion on Craig's Instagram, which I will put the link in the chat in a second. It's Bizarre LA. And I said, would you come on and talk about this? I've always been fascinated. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I've always been fascinated with the Biltmore. Obviously, is an amazing place to visit. Everyone should walk through those lobbies. I think one of the points that I have found most compelling with the Netflix series that deals with the hotel, Cecil, is there's some of the history, but it's not always accurate. And that's what I appreciate about your approach, like even going so far as to sort of correct the Wikipedia as the year the hotel was built. But so many of these hotels have had deaths. In your book, there are 32 deaths that you list at the Hotel del Coronado. And I thought your point was great, which the Hotel del Coronado was almost like a health spa, and people would go there. So they get there in bad health, and then they would just expire at the hotel.
Die, yeah.
But
yeah.
That is a lot of deaths in one building, though. 32 deaths, and probably more, even on that property.
There's the Hollywood Roosevelt is close to 30. Okay. And when you start thinking that the Cecil is what, maybe 18 to 20 deaths that we know of, it's not that high a number compared to some of these other buildings. And there were murders at the Hollywood Roosevelt as well.
Well, right. And there's like a website where you can see if your own property has had a death in it. I want to encourage anyone who has a question. We have about 11 minutes left. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Greg, go ahead and post that in the Q&A. And I know John is hiding somewhere in the background, but go ahead and post that in the Q&A. In the meantime, I will keep asking some questions until we get some in that Q&A. So one of the things that we had talked about was, how do you use this idea of the paranormal? Let's say, I own a haunted house in Florida, and I'll put the link. The house has its own Instagram, where I've heard, numerous things, and, you can believe or not believe, but I choose to believe, because there are just too many incidences of footsteps and voices and, music and radios and things and bangings and things like that. So if you're a person and you think that your house might have, haunts or spirits, what are some ways that, a historic property owner can approach this?
Well, I use newspaper archives a lot, but a lot of times, if you're hearing creaking noises or whatnot, sometimes just look and pull the permits and find out what was being used. Also, if you can get a name of past owners and actually do a genealogical search on them. I think a lot of the hauntings, or probably some kind of emotional connection or energy that is lingering behind. That's kind of what my appeal about the whole haunting thing is. I as a historian, I want to connect to the past so badly that this is, it's a cool idea to think that there is a part of the past that actually is still with us, and that, the history isn't as dead as what some people would have us believe it is. But you look for an emotional connection. I have tons of stories about where, just doing the research, you can kind of figure out who the suspect might be, or who you think might, their energy or their whatever is, it may be lingering behind. But
right. Well, one historic house I was working on, I did some research, and it was a Victorian era house, and you used to hold the bodies in state, right, in the living room, and a lot of people would mostly die at their house and not at the hospital. And just in regular historical terms, I think 3 or 4 people had died in this house from the same family. That's just what happened. That's just how it was. And so, you can kind of go back into the history of some of these buildings and look at that. And I do think the point you made, that you can use some of this paranormal for a historic site, it does bring in visitors. It does bring in repeat guests.
It does. The Hotel del Coronado probably gets an A for how it's marketing. Now, the thing is that they were almost kind of forced to admit that it was haunted, because what ended up happening is in the 80s, while Vice President George H. Bush was visiting, Secret Service stayed in one of the haunted rooms, and he asked for a room change in the middle of the night. So that became national news. And the hotel was kind of embarrassed and finally had to kind of admit, yeah, there is something wrong with it. But they only would cop to one, and that's the death of Kate Morgan in 1892, which they marketed really well. That room sells out a lot. And last time I was there, they had a latte named after her, so you could get the Kate Morgan latte, you know. And they were responsible. The tours would be responsible. The Dawsons, you know, they won't tell you all the dark stories there. And they kind of gloss over the fight between Babcock and Story and some of the other people that were connected, Spreckles. My book, I go into it because I want to know what caused the fracture in their relationships. Mm-hmm. But because I think that it may not be germane to the hauntings in itself, but if you get a sense of what the mentality was, what the purpose of the hotel was, how it changed over the years, you know, it does add perspective. But yeah, there was some weird stuff that happened at the Dell for sure.
Well, the Biltmore had a drink called the Black Dahlia. I remember at the bar, and wandering through the Biltmore, I always felt like must be like wandering through the Titanic or something. I stayed there once on purpose just so I could swim in the pool, which was in the basement. It's the original pool is in the basement, so I've stayed at the Biltmore repeatedly just to swim in the pool, actually, and wander about. And I was going to ask you another question, it escaped me.
Oh, that's okay. Well, Biltmore claims, you know, the Black Dahlia haunts it. That's part of its
right.
That's
I wouldn't doubt it.
Lore. And they're kind of cagey about it. You know, it just kind of depends on who you'll talk to, who they'll admit. But there are some ghosts that apparently do pop up in the cocktail bar. It's not Black Dahlia by description, but some people that have claimed to have seen her claim that she's riding up and down the elevators, or they'll see her there. But there's definitely some floors there that are haunted. There are some rooms, you know, very specific places. In contrast, the Cecil doesn't have any haunted floors. It doesn't have any haunted rooms. So despite its dark history and despite the sensationalism, there really haven't been any really confirmable ghost stories about the Cecil at all. It'll be interesting because, you know, right now you're having a lot of people that have seen, you know, Ghost Adventures, have seen the Netflix show. Mm-hmm. They're finding ways in the building, and they're doing these things that they rush up on YouTube, and they're using controversial ghost hunting devices that I would never use because they tend to produce false positives. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's going to be real interesting to watch. But right now, the Cecil Hotel, it's really in limbo what's going to happen. They're not really.
Oh, you reminded me. I was going to share a document. Thank you. That's exactly what I was thinking. I know John has some Q&As. Actually, we're having a little technical difficulty, and I can't see in the questions that are coming in. One, I can answer myself. Did the Night Stalker live at the Cecil Hotel? Yes. Yes. And that is known. So definitely that's there. But what I wanted to share for the Hotel Cecil is a 66-page document from the city of Los Angeles, and it's a planning document. This is for us building nerds, but I will share the link in the chat, and it's a lot of information more about the history of the hotel, pictures, and things like that. I've just shared that from LA City. John, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, we've got a mix of questions here. I think there's a lot of skeptics in the room, so maybe I'll start with that.
Sure.
So some people are asking the same question in different ways, like how do you separate the BS from the real hauntings? How do you see why are paranormal experiences only associated with hospitality properties, for example, or at least that was their sense from the way you've described this. Are there any other properties like somebody else asked, what if so many people die in a hospital, why aren't hospitals as haunted as they would be?
Sure. Well, I'll answer all three real quick. I am a skeptic. I mean, it takes a lot to impress me whether a place is haunted or not. I am a believer as opposed to a non-believer. The smoking gun is always finding out when the ghost stories start first going public, and what year, who said it, and then just start researching the character of the person that was saying it. And you'll get a really good idea of whether or not these stories are true or not. Glen Tavern Inn, for instance, most people that go in there, they're told that the top floor of the Glen Tavern Inn used to be a speakeasy or a bordello, and that a gambler had been murdered in a crooked card game, and also a woman was beheaded. You know, and they don't even get the exact year or time of that it is. They just say, oh, it's Prohibition, but I've heard it's 70s. I've heard it all over the place. Here's the thing, is those ghost stories literally started in the mid 1980s during a time when the hotel was failing as a resort. And so there probably was paranormal activity, but the owners or the leaseholders had brought in a psychic who did this walkthrough. And the first story that came up was the murdered gambler. And that met with some resistance. So then, you know, by 2 years later, then the floor was introduced as a speakeasy, even though it's literally doesn't make any common sense why you would have a speakeasy on a third floor when everyone can hear everything going on the third floor from the second floor. So you couldn't hide any kind of secret vice, organized vice, on a third floor of a building. And also the history just kind of supports it. That was attic space. It was converted into guest rooms, completed by 1920. Find out when the fire escapes were added to the third floor. There were no, you know, if you're going to have a speakeasy, you've got to have an escape route, right? You know, and so you can have a speakeasy on a third floor without any fire escapes or, you know, any way to get in and get out. So, and it was built across the street from a church who, you know, it would have been the worst kept secret ever. But the ghost stories didn't appear until the 1980s, but it was marketed as such to where, you know, people automatically believe it. Second thing, I focused on hotels because it actually, I could stay there for 4 or 5 days. It's one of the few like historic haunted places that actually won't exist if people don't stay overnight. But hotels aren't the only venue by any means that attract. Hospitals, sanitariums are definitely almost all haunted. I mean, my children were born in Huntington Hospital in Pasadena, and there's ghost stories about Huntington Hospital, a fully functional hospital today. Another place that I think seems to attract paranormal activity are the old movie palaces. Tons of them. Almost all of the ones in seems like downtown Los Angeles have a ghost story or so. And you know, I can't explain every single thing. I just take things on case by case. I wish I could spend overnight, you know, 24 hours a day for about 4 or 5 days, because you get a real good sense of whether or not there's any truth to the paranormal claims.
Yeah, I think the theater thing is you told a story in your book about being on, I think it's the Warner Brothers lot and one of the,
Yeah.
and then hearing somebody talking and singing. I don't know how to explain that, but I've also heard sometimes, I mean, all three of us I've been in hundreds of buildings, and some
Yeah.
definitely have a different factor than others. There's no way to explain it.
Yeah.
So I have one more question in here, and then we'll wrap it up. Is how do you separate some of these stories? You know, sometimes the fake story is kind of, you know, sexier than the real story. But so when you're telling the story, I think you did a good job in your book differentiating sort of the ghost stories from the real history. How do you define that yourself as an author and a historian?
I thought that, well, you know, a good thing is using common sense, actually using, you know, critical thinking. But also, like I had said earlier, find out when the ghost story started. And that usually is the smoking gun. For instance, I cast shade as to whether or not Kate Morgan actually is the ghost at the Hotel del Coronado, because what most people won't tell you, not even the hotel, is that That was a long forgotten death in 1892. Now, people had been seeing a woman in a black Victorian dress wandering around, but there was a poltergeist room up on the very top floor, and it was a historian in San Diego that decided, I'm going to get to the root of this. I'm going to find out who this ghost is. So he goes and he finds this, he does soften, he stumbles across Kate Morgan's story, and he embellishes it. He changes some things that should not have been changed. Bad, shame for a historian to do. And he introduced it in San Diego Home and Garden, their Halloween edition, and it went viral. And then they found out years later, it was the wrong room. It wasn't even the room Kate Morgan had stayed in, but this Kate Morgan story had already launched. And then it was another author in 1989, it was a lawyer named Alan May. He looked through the original registrar from the Hotel del Coronado, and he actually correctly found the real Kate Morgan room that she actually stayed in, which turned out to be on the 3rd floor. Well, wouldn't you know, as soon as he introduced that, guess what happened? Skeptics will guess it really quick. That 3rd floor room became haunted overnight. And now it's considered one of the haunted rooms. And so it kind of makes you wonder, you know, is Kate Morgan really the ghost there or not? And as far as they asked Alan May, okay, so you're saying that Kate Morgan only haunts the 3rd floor room. Well, but what about that top floor? And Alan May, shortly before he died, he had a friend that was in the Navy, and he said, "Oh, it was a housekeeper that had helped Kate Morgan," and he based that only solely on an 1892 registrar and layout that said that was a maintenance closet, that room on the 5th floor in 1892. Well, I don't know how long that was a maintenance closet, you know, but they took that one little bit and then they concocted this whole thing about a maid dying. And some even have said that the maid was murdered by the same person that murdered Kate Morgan. I mean, so many conspiracy theories came up, and that I've even heard that they're buried in the same grave. None of that's true. I mean,
Right.
you know,
Well, at least we're all having
that's how it
fun.
starts.
Yeah. At least we have fun with the stories. I plan
Yeah.
on haunting John from the grave. Actually, he'll hear my
Oh.
voice come over the Zoom. I'll say, "John, it's me. You can't get away." But we need to close up, Craig. I want to thank you for all of your time. I posted your
Sure.
Instagram in the chat if anyone wants to follow you, and they can also follow that link to get your book.
Yeah, I wanted to add a
Yes,
question
thank
to
you.
that. Somebody from Facebook was saying, well, your book is entitled Volume 1, and they want maybe a preview or a hint as to what will be in Volume 2.
Well, I did. This presentation was the Aztec Hotel, the Queen Mary. A lot of these places will be in Volume 2.
Okay.
I want to have a big party at the Queen Mary one of these days. That
Oh,
place
yeah.
is crazy. That's
Yeah.
a fun place.
Yeah, I was
All right.
skeptical of that one, but I was surprised. It actually does have some degree of paranormal activity. Now, is it as haunted as what people say it is? I question it, but it does have some paranormal activity.
Feels weird when you're there.
Yeah.
Anyways, well, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to remind everybody that we're going to be starting our modernism program next Tuesday, and those will be free lunchinars, just like this one. All right, John, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, we've got one more link in the chat box here that I just pasted there. So let us know how we did today. I'm sure Craig would appreciate it. But we also have a field there, and we'll share that with Craig. But we also have a field on that form that lets us know what you want to see in future programs. So we still have a lot of room in our schedule in the coming year. So we want to hear where your thoughts are in terms of speakers and other programs. With that being said, I'll leave this chat box link up, and then we can everybody else can leave when they'd like.
Tuesday.
Yeah, we'll see you next Tuesday.
All right, thanks, Craig.
Thank you for having me out.
All right, bye.
Bye.